Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're not just looking at a law. We're exploring one of the uh, most agonizing moral dilemmas in modern medicine and policy, the race against time for the terminally ill.
hmm
We're wading into the complex world of the right to try movement. These are the laws designed to give patients access to investigational drugs long before the FDA gives its full final approval.
And it really is a topic that's defined by this inherent tension, isn't it? It's a massive conflict between, the patient's understandable primal desire for immediate hope for anything that could be life-saving,
Of course.
and then society's absolute need for rigorous safety and efficacy standards in drug development. So our mission for this deep dive is to really unpack that entire story. We need to look at the history, the current dual pathways.
Right, the FDA's expanded access versus these newer right to try laws.
Exactly. The old versus the new. And we need to analyze why this legislative triumph for advocates has simultaneously become such a deep well of controversy for bioethicists and regulatory experts.
And to truly understand the intense political and emotional power behind this movement, we can't just start with the regulations. That would be a mistake. We have to start with a person.
You have to.
The flashpoint, the story that really fueled this entire national push, can be traced directly back to the compelling and, frankly, heartbreaking case of Andrea Sloan, an attorney in Austin, Texas, back in 2013.
Andrea Sloan was 45 years old, and she had been diagnosed with late-stage recurrent ovarian cancer. She'd already walked the entire traditional path. She had exhausted all the standard, approved treatments that were available to her.
So her back was against the wall.
Completely. Her physicians believed they had one last best shot, an investigational drug called BMN 673.
BMN 673. This was part of a promising new class of treatments, a kind of precision medicine known as a PRP inhibitor. It was developed by BioMarin Pharmaceutical. This was the hope she needed, but she immediately ran into a wall of, bureaucracy and regulation.
And the problem was, because her cancer was so advanced and what they call refractory, meaning it wasn't responding to the standard care, she was disqualified from enrolling in the formal clinical trial.
So the front door was closed to her.
The front door was closed. So her doctors, seeing how urgent this was, they sought access through the existing federal mechanism, the FDA's Expanded Access Program. A lot of people just call it compassionate use.
Right.
And this is where the story pivots and becomes so important for understanding the whole rationale behind right to try. The FDA, after they reviewed her case, they confirmed she was a candidate for expanded access.
So they greenlit it.
They essentially greenlit the regulatory part of it, and they often do so incredibly quickly in cases like hers. But that FDA approval, that confirmation, it does not, and it has never guaranteed access to the drug itself.
That ultimate decision, the non-negotiable one, rests entirely with the company that owns the compound. In this case, BioMarin. And BioMarin, they declined her request for BMN 673.
Yeah, and their reasoning, while you could argue it was medically cautious, was, let's just say it was stark. And it generated massive public outrage. At the time of her request, BMN 673 was in a very, very early stage of development.
Really?
It had only just completed a phase I trial. We're talking about a tiny group, just 39 patients. So BioMarin argued that to give the drug to an end-stage patient outside of that highly controlled, monitored trial environment would be scientifically unethical and reckless.
Unethical and reckless. Those are strong words.
Very strong. They emphasized the immense unknown risks, the things they just couldn't predict yet with a drug that had barely been tested in humans.
And that denial just became this public lightning rod. Social media amplified her story almost instantly. There was a Change.org petition demanding access that just circulated everywhere, and it got over 230,000 signatures.
It was incredible. And her dedicated Facebook community, they called themselves Andy's Army, it swelled to over 15,000 followers. This was one of the clearest, earliest examples of how patients and their families could use the internet to create overwhelming pressure.
On both the companies and, of course, the lawmakers.
But even with all that public support, all that political pressure, BioMarin held its position. They cited the integrity of their clinical trial process, their duty to patient safety across the board.
So what happened to Andrea Sloan?
Well, she eventually did manage to gain access to a different, similar PRP inhibitor from another company, which remained unidentified. But tragically, the delay had been too long.
Oh, no.
Her cancer had just progressed too far. It was past the point of being treatable, and she died shortly after starting that alternative therapy.
And that story, that denial, that struggle, that tragic outcome, it provided the perfect, visceral, emotional fuel for this movement.
Absolutely. Advocacy groups, and particularly the Goldwater Institute, they seized on her story and others like it. The frustration wasn't just about the company's denial, it was about the perceived slowness and the complexity of the existing expanded access program. They argued that that bureaucracy directly contributed to her death.
So this perceived regulatory failure, that's what directly sparked the national right to try legislative push. A demand for a new pathway, one that was completely outside of FDA review, one that bypassed all the perceived red tape. Okay, so let's unpack the system that the right to try advocates were so determined to bypass. Because you really can't challenge the FDA's power without understanding why the FDA got that power in the first place. This is essential context.
I agree. You have to look at the foundational structure of drug regulation, which governs, the safety and efficacy standards for every single drug developed in the United States.
And it's crucial to understand that our current system isn't something that was proactively designed in a boardroom. It's a reaction. It's a reaction to tragedy.
It's always a reaction to tragedy. Before 1938, drug manufacturers operated in, well, you called it the Wild West earlier, and that's perfect. You had snake oil, you had dangerous compounds sold openly, and the government had almost no power to intervene unless it could prove outright fraud after people had already been harmed.
That started to change in 1938 with the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, the FDCA. And this was a direct response to a tragedy involving something called a sulfanilamide elixir.
It used a toxic solvent, diethylene glycol, which is basically antifreeze, and it killed over 100 people. A lot of them were children.
Awful.
So the FDCA gave the FDA the power to demand proof of safety before a drug could be marketed. But, and this is the crucial loophole, once a drug was on the market, the law didn't require any proof that it actually worked.
So it just had to not kill you immediately. It didn't have to help you.
Exactly. And that glaring gap, that proof of safety without proof of effectiveness, that was fixed fundamentally in 1962 with the pivotal Kefauver-Harris Amendment. This was the monumental shift that truly created the modern FDA that we know today.
And this was another reaction to a tragedy, right? The thalidomide disaster.
It was. Thalidomide was a sedative used in Europe that caused severe birth defects in thousands of babies. And although the drug was never approved in the U.S., thanks to a very cautious FDA reviewer named Francis Kelsey,
Right.
the tragedy overseas spurred Congress to act. The amendment eliminated that old loophole and required manufacturers to submit what the law called substantial evidence that a drug was not just safe, but also effective for its intended use before it could ever be sold.
And that one word, effective, established in 1962, is what laid the entire groundwork for the multi-phase system of clinical trials that we rely on today. The whole process is structured precisely to collect that substantial evidence methodically and, minimize risk along the way.
And understanding those trial stages is absolutely essential because it defines the risk profile of every single drug that might be sought under.
Right to try. Drug development is a funnel. It starts incredibly broad and it narrows dramatically as that safety and efficacy data is collected. Okay, let's start at the top of that funnel. Phase 1.
Phase 1 is the initial safety check. The primary focus is defining the drug safety profile, identifying any major toxicities, and figuring out the maximum tolerated dose for the later trials. The groups are tiny, usually 20 to 80 volunteers.
And these are healthy volunteers?
Sometimes. For many drugs, yes, they use healthy volunteers. But for highly toxic treatments, like for cancer, the volunteers are often patients who already have the disease because it wouldn't be ethical to give such a potent compound to someone who is healthy.
And this is really the lowest bar, isn't it?
It is the absolute lowest bar. About 60% of compounds advance from phase 1. So that means 40%, a huge number, fail at the very first hurdle, usually because of unacceptable toxicity or because the drug just doesn't behave the way it's supposed to in the body.
But the question it's answering is just, is it so toxic that we can't even test it further?
That's it. It provides almost zero insight into whether the drug will actually help a patient with their condition.
Okay, so if a drug passes phase 1, it moves to phase 2. What happens there?
Phase 2 is the first real test of effectiveness. The drug is now tested in a larger group of patient volunteers, people who actually have the disease. The goals here are twofold. First, to assess efficacy, to see if there's an early signal that the drug is doing what it's supposed to do.
In second.
And second, to identify common short-term side effects and risks. You're looking for that crucial early hint that it's working.
Now, this is where the funnel gets, as you said, terrifyingly narrow.
Terrifyingly is the word. Phase 2 has the absolute lowest success rate of any phase in drug development. Almost 70% of drugs that made it past phase I fail to move beyond this stage.
Wow. Why is the failure rate so high there?
Well, they fail for a couple of reasons. Sometimes they show unacceptable toxicity that just wasn't obvious in the tiny phase I group, but more commonly, they don't work. They aren't any better than a placebo or the current standard of care.
70%. I think we all just sort of assume that if a drug is in a trial, it's probably going to work. But that statistic is just staggering. That huge failure rate in phase 2 really should give anyone pause when they're thinking about accessing a drug that's only past phase 1.
Precisely. And only those very few successful candidates that survive phase 2 get to move on to phase 3.
And this is the big one.
This is the big one. This is the large-scale testing. It's intended to produce statistically significant data on safety, on efficacy, on the overall benefit-risk relationship. This phase can involve up to 5,000 volunteers, often all over the world, and it requires massive resources. The data from this phase is the absolute core of the new drug application, the final submission to the FDA.
So if we look at the entire pipeline, from the moment a compound enters human testing, what are the odds it actually makes it to market? For cancer drugs, for instance.
The statistics are sobering. Only about 5% of all cancer drugs, a category that's very frequently sought under a right to try, are ultimately approved for patient use.
5%.
5%. And that statistic is fundamental to this whole debate. It means 95% of the drugs that patients might seek under right to try are, statistically, destined to be ineffective, too unsafe, or both. The drugs available under RTT have only cleared that initial 40% failure rate of phase on. They still face a massive 95% chance of ultimate failure down the line.
But as we talked about with Andrea Sloan, the FDA did recognize this need for access outside of a clinical trial. They did have a system in place long before a right to try became a political movement.
They did. They created the formal Expanded Access or Compassionate Use Program. This was officially codified into law in the Food and Drug Administration Modernization Act of 1997.
And who is that pathway for?
It's designed for patients who are seriously or immediately life-threatened, who lack a comparable or satisfactory alternative therapy, and critically, who are unable to qualify for an existing clinical trial.
And what's the regulatory threshold there?
The physician has to certify that the potential benefits to that specific patient outweigh the known or potential risks, and that giving the drug to this one person won't interfere with the ongoing trials that are needed for full approval for everyone else.
So even with this established, legally reviewed pathway, it was subject to these loud and persistent critiques from advocates like the Goldwater Institute.
Oh, absolutely. They argued that the expanded access program was fatally flawed. They called it overly bureaucratic, complicated, and slow. They framed the time involved as a regulatory delay that amounted to a death sentence for patients who just didn't have months to wait for forms to clear.
And that critique about bureaucracy, it really targeted two specific things, right? The application itself and the IRB review.
Exactly. The complexity of the application form was a huge issue. And the second was a requirement for oversight by an institutional review board, or IRB. For a doctor practicing outside a major university hospital or an academic center, getting that IRB review could be a huge administrative hurdle that just prolonged the process considerably.
What's really fascinating here, and something that often got ignored in the political debate, is the hard data the FDA used to counter that slow FDA narrative.
Yes, the FDA repeatedly stated that they were generally not the barrier in the EA process. For emergency requests, they often review and approve the vast majority of expanded access requests. They cite an approval rate that's often over 99%.
And they do it quickly.
Very quickly, frequently within 24 hours. Sometimes, for the most urgent cases, they approve them in just a few hours over the phone.
So this is really the crux of the institutional conflict we're looking at. The FDA was saying, we approve almost everything instantly, while the advocates were countering, the application is so complex and terrifying that it discourages doctors from even submitting it, making the whole process too slow on the front end.
And that's it. The perceived length of the process was rooted in those administrative hurdles and, ultimately, in the manufacturer's final decision. It wasn't about the FDA's willingness to say yes.
So the barrier wasn't the FDA saying no. It was this complex form that, might require a dedicated regulatory staff member just to fill it out. I can absolutely see why a busy community oncologist already drowning in paperwork would hesitate to take on that monumental task. They needed to find a way to eliminate or at least drastically simplify that administrative overhead.
And that administrative frustration, you combine that with the powerful, undeniable political momentum that was fueled by these emotional stories like Andre Sloan's, and you create a perfect storm. Advocacy groups leverage this tension with an ideology that was really advocating for sweeping deregulation in the medical sphere.
And that is how the Right to Try movement became such a powerful national legislative success.
Yes, and the intellectual and organizational engine that was driving this entire movement was the Goldwater Institute. They're a prominent libertarian think tank based in Arizona. And they weren't just providing talking points, they were the architects. They provided the exact model template legislation that was then quickly adopted and passed by state legislatures all across the country.
And what was their core rationale? How did they sell it?
Their rationale was simple, direct, and incredibly compelling on an emotional level. They argued the FDA regulatory framework was broken, and that the time it took for a drug to get approved amounted to a death sentence. Their central question resonated widely in state houses. Why is the government standing in the way of a potential cure?
They framed it as the government blocking hope.
They framed RTT laws as limiting the FDA's oversight and restoring what they presented as the patient's constitutional right to access these treatments.
But this idea of a constitutional right to access experimental drugs, it's actually pretty complex, isn't it? In fact, it was previously rejected in the federal courts. We should probably pause and look at the key legal precedent here. The 2007 case, Abigail Alliance for Better Access to Developmental Drugs v. von Eschenbach.
Yes, this is a critical legal counterpoint to the RTT movement's fundamental claim. The Abigail Alliance argued that terminally ill patients had a constitutional right, specifically protected by the 5th and 14th Amendments, to substantive due process, which they claimed included the right to life, and that this extended to accessing post-phase I investigational drugs.
But the court didn't agree.
No. The D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals ultimately rejected that claim. They ruled that the constitutional right to life and liberty does not include a fundamental right to access unapproved drugs. They confirmed that FDA regulation of post-phase I drugs is entirely consistent with the historical tradition of prohibiting the sale of unsafe and ineffective drugs.
So in essence, the government has a legitimate public interest in protecting patients, even terminally ill patients, from products that lack substantial proof of efficacy.
Precisely. So the RTT movement wasn't confirming some existing constitutional right. It was explicitly legislating around a clear judicial decision that upheld the FDA's regulatory authority. It was a political end run around the entire regulatory framework, designed to create a separate pathway completely outside of the FDA's control.
And the political campaign backing this was, frankly, brilliant. They successfully leveraged these individual patient stories, often using social media like Andy's Army, and then amplified them through mainstream media outlets. You'd see these headlines engineered to generate maximum outrage, things like, "Company denies drug to dying child."
It was a very patient-centric, high-pressure strategy, and it significantly increased the pressure on politicians to be seen as doing something to fix the system.
The initial strategy was to target conservative states, right? Where deregulation and individual liberty arguments would resonate strongly.
That's right. Colorado was the very first state to pass a right to try law in 2014. Arizona and Texas followed pretty quickly. But the movement's true political power was demonstrated when it rapidly gained bipartisan traction. It started spreading to traditionally liberal states like California and Oregon, states that you'd normally see as strong supporters of consumer protection and strong regulation.
California's law, for example, took effect in January 2017. And that was significant because Governor Jerry Brown had actually vetoed a similar RTT bill the year before.
He did. He argued that he wanted to wait and see if the changes the FDA was making to the expanded access program, streamlining the paperwork, would resolve the issue first. But when proponents came back and claimed that the wait times and administrative hurdles were still there for many patients, the bill eventually passed.
It sounds like the political environment just became toxic for anyone who expressed any caution.
It really did. One regulatory critic noted that voting against these laws was, I'm quoting here, about as palatable to most people as criticizing mom's apple pie and the American flag. It became virtually impossible for any politician to stand up and argue against hope for the dying, even if they had legitimate regulatory or safety concerns.
And the result was this astonishing, rapid legislative cascade all across the country. By the time Congress was pressured into taking federal action, 40 states had already adopted some form of right-to-try law.
It eventually reached 41 states, with Alaska's enactment in July 2018. This massive state-level success laid the perfect foundation for the federal law.
And that state momentum, It culminated in the ultimate legislative victory for right-to-try advocates, the federal law. It was signed by President Trump on May 30th, 2018, and it was officially named the Trickett-Wendler, Frank Mangiello, Jordan McClin, and Matthew Bellina Right-to-Try Act of 2017. It created a unified national framework.
The Federal Act was positioned as the creation of national standards and rules by which investigational drugs may be provided to terminally ill patients. And President Trump really reinforced this viewpoint in his 2018 State of the Union address, where he argued that terminally ill people should not have to go from country to country to seek a cure. The sentiment was clear. America should provide this hope at home.
But regardless of the national standards, the new rules, here is the single most critical feature of all right-to-try legislation, both state and federal. The law is permissive, not mandatory. Let me say that again. A manufacturer cannot be compelled, under any circumstances, to provide access to a drug under this act.
That's the whole ballgame right there.
Yeah.
The pharmaceutical company, not the government, remains the sole, final gatekeeper of access.
So let's dive into the specifics. Who qualifies for this new parallel pathway under the federal law?
Okay, there are 4 core criteria for patient eligibility. The first key change was the definition of the disease itself. The patient must be diagnosed with a life-threatening disease or condition.
And that's a broader standard, isn't it? Broader than the immediately life-threatening language that was used in some of the older expanded access contexts, which really implies that death is imminent.
It is much broader. And Senator Ron Johnson, who was a key advocate for the law, specifically chose that broader definition. He wanted to ensure the RTT pathway could include patients with chronic, progressive illnesses that were ultimately terminal, but where the decline might take years, something like Duchenne muscular dystrophy.
Okay, what are the other requirements for the patient?
The second and third requirements speak to the patient's existing options. The patient must have exhausted approved treatment options, so there's no current FDA-approved drug available for their specific situation. And third, they must be unable to participate in a clinical trial involving the eligible investigational drug.
And there's a requirement for the doctor certifying this, right?
Yes, and it's a crucial one. That certification that the patient can't get into a trial, often because they're too sick or don't meet the restrictive criteria, it must be provided by a physician who is in good standing. And that physician cannot receive any compensation from the manufacturer for making that certification.
Which is a provision intended to reduce the risk of kickbacks or any kind of undue influence from the drug companies.
Exactly. And the fourth requirement for the patient is that they have to provide written informed consent.
Now, that sounds straightforward, but you mentioned it's actually a point of massive regulatory controversy.
It is, because the Federal RTT Act specifically states that the definition of informed consent used for this pathway does not have to use the rigorous existing federal regulations that define what proper informed consent must include for, say, a clinical trial.
And that is a fundamental difference from the FDA's expanded access process.
A huge difference. Under EA, the consent process is highly structured. It requires explicit detail about all the known risks, the experimental nature of the drug, the alternatives available, potential costs. By removing those federal standards for RTT consent, critics argue the law potentially leaves these very vulnerable patients less informed about the true risks.
Including their financial exposure.
Including their financial exposure, which is not guaranteed to be covered by insurance at all.
Okay, so that's the patient side. Let's pivot to the drug requirements. What makes a drug eligible?
There are 4 criteria for an investigational drug to qualify for RTT access. The first, and this is the most debated one, is that the drug must have completed a Phase I clinical trial.
And we already talked about just how low that bar is. Phase I is purely a search for major toxicities in the right dose. It gives you no proof of efficacy and really minimal long-term safety data. Experts argue that setting the requirements solely at Phase I completion is dangerously low.
It absolutely is. And furthermore, the Act is written broadly enough that it doesn't always specify if the Phase I trial must have been completed for the requested use. It's a bit of a gray area. Now, manufacturers often self-regulate this, but the law itself provides very little mandatory rigor.
And what are the other 3 criteria for the drug?
The other 3 maintain a link to the larger regulatory process. First, the drug must not be approved for any other use. This prevents RTT from interfering with the well-established practice of doctors prescribing approved drugs for off-label uses.
Okay.
Second, the manufacturer must be actively investigating the drug in a clinical trial that's intended to form the primary basis of a claim of effectiveness, and the drug must be the subject of an active investigational new drug application, or IND.
The IND requirement is important, right? It means the FDA is at least aware of the drug and its development plan.
It is. The IND is the regulatory gate that allows human clinical trial to even begin. And the final requirement is that the drug must be in active development, so it can't be something the company has discontinued, and it can't be subject to a clinical hold by the FDA.
So we have this parallel process. What is the FDA's role once an RTT request is made?
It's almost non-existent.
Really?
The FDA does not review or approve right to try requests, and that is the key distinguishing factor from expanded access. The FDA's role is strictly limited to passively receiving and posting the required information that's submitted by the company. They have zero oversight over the individual decision-making process between the patient, the physician, and the manufacturer.
And this lack of oversight is coupled with a specific reporting structure that seems designed to address the industry's biggest fear: regulatory fallout.
It was designed explicitly for that purpose. Companies have to file a yearly report to Health and Human Services, or HHS. It includes the number of doses supplied, patients treated, the uses, and any known serious adverse events.
And here's the critical, controversial incentive for the manufacturers. The Act limits the FDA's ability to use the clinical outcomes from RTT use when it's reviewing that drug's eventual marketing application.
That's right. The FDA can only use that adverse event data if they determine it is critical to determining the safety of the drug, or if the sponsor, the drug company itself, requests its use.
So you can think of it like this. Right to try is a high-risk test run, but the drug company gets to put a regulatory wall around the results. If a terminally ill patient who is inherently fragile has a serious adverse event, the FDA can't automatically use that against the drug's application.
It protects the research pipeline from what a company might deem a statistical anomaly in a very, very sick person. This provision was specifically intended to remove one of the major industry disincentives for providing the drug. Manufacturers were terrified that a single negative outcome outside of a controlled trial would derail years and billions of dollars of research. It's a protection for the pipeline, prioritizing that eventual widespread approval over the data integrity of these individual compassionate use cases. And this brings us right to the core controversy. While RTT was a massive political and legislative triumph, its implementation has drawn fire from numerous quarters. Critics, and we're talking about practicing physicians, bioethicists, regulatory bodies, they've characterized the act as a cruel sham or even placebo legislation.
A cruel sham.
Why? Their argument is very pointed. They say it offers false hope and strips away vital patient protections without actually guaranteeing any increase in access.
The most immediate and, I think, visceral argument against RTT really rests on patient safety and that low bar it sets. When a drug is only required to have completed phase I, critics say that RTT sets a dangerously low bar for patient experimentation.
Dangerously low is an understatement. Phase I trials, as we've established, are minimal. They are solely designed to find major toxicities and the maximum tolerated dose. They do not demonstrate efficacy, and regulatory experts have stated it is utterly impossible for such a small, short trial to accurately determine long-term safety or efficacy. The patient is looking at a 95% chance the drug will ultimately fail.
And the risk isn't just that it's a waste of precious time, it's the risk of actual physical harm, even to a terminally ill patient.
Of course. A terminally ill patient could suffer severe toxicity, which would greatly diminish the quality of their remaining time with their family. Or they could suffer an acute, life-threatening adverse event that actually hastens their death, often without any corresponding therapeutic benefit.
Are there real-world examples of this, where a drug looked okay in phase I but turned out to be dangerous later?
Yes, and we have crucial cautionary examples of why phase I completion is just not sufficient protection. Take the case of a cancer drug called Amonifide. It successfully passed phase I testing. They established a safe dosage range. But when it moved into the larger patient population of phase II trials, it demonstrated life-threatening hematologic toxicity.
What does that mean?
Severe and unpredictable side effects related to blood cells, things that would have been absolutely devastating for a patient outside of a highly monitored trial. This example clearly illustrates just how far away phase I is from proving a drug is truly safe or effective enough for even compassionate use without strict oversight.
And beyond the medical risk, critics point out that RTT laws strip away critical patient protections that are standard under the FDA's expanded access pathway.
They do. Under EA, patients retain fundamental protections like the ability to sue for malpractice. And the Drug Administration is subject to rigorous oversight by an institutional review board, the IRB.
The IRB is a crucial firewall, isn't it? Especially for vulnerable populations.
It's an independent ethical review committee, and it's required for any human experimentation. The IRB scrutinizes the proposed treatment plan. It ensures the informed consent document is complete and transparent, including outlining all the financial responsibilities, and it confirms that the request won't interfere with existing clinical trials.
And under right to try, that changes dramatically.
There is no mandatory IRB oversight. And while the federal RTT Act does limit the manufacturer's liability, critics noted that by removing those standards on what must be included in the written informed consent, the law shifts power away from the regulatory body and toward the manufacturer. This could potentially leave these vulnerable, desperate patients underinformed about the financial costs or the true minimal evidence base behind the treatment they're receiving.
But I think the single greatest undeniable barrier for both RTT supporters and critics is the manufacturer bottleneck. This really seems to be the crux of the practical failure of RTT.
It is the absolute core of the problem. Neither the state RT2 laws nor the federal act can compel a company to provide the drug.
And the industry's reluctance seems perfectly rational when you look at the factors. First, just the practical side. Supply constraints.
Companies generally only manufacture enough of an investigational drug to support their tightly controlled clinical trials. Ramping up an entirely separate industrial-scale production line for non-trial patients is not a minor undertaking. Are we talking about a simple pill or a highly complex biologic that requires specialized facilities? The latter is incredibly costly and difficult to scale quickly.
And then there's the sheer financial disincentive.
A huge one. Developing a new drug is estimated to cost around $2.6 billion. The RTT Act requires companies to comply with regulations that limit cost recovery to just direct costs. They can't profit from RTT use. So for a publicly traded company, diverting massive resources and time to manufacture a product that they can't charge a premium for and which carries significant legal and reputational risk is extremely unappealing to boards and shareholders.
And in fact, many major companies have just said this explicitly. They're choosing the path of least resistance and maximum safety.
They are. Pharmaceutical giants like Janssen and Bristol-Myers Squibb have publicly stated they will continue to funnel all pre-approval requests through the FDA's established expanded access pathway. They prefer the FDA's regulatory input for patient safety, and they gain a layer of legal protection and standardization through that established reviewed process that RTT just lacks.
Which leads directly to the question of measurable success. Critics have noted that even after RTT laws were adopted across 41 states, there was no published peer-reviewed data showing that these laws had actually resulted in a significant increase in the number of patients accessing experimental therapies. The pathway was legislated, but the access wasn't realized.
That's right. And the Goldwater Institute countered this by pointing out that the FDA's existing expanded access program only saw about 1,000 patients utilize the process per year before the RTT laws, underscoring the massive perceived need for some alternative. But the full reality is that the RTT pathway, as it's designed, depends entirely on the voluntary consent of the industry, which often just defaults to the more established FDA-reviewed route because of safety, liability, and logistical concerns.
So, if these highly publicized right-to-try laws, despite the legislative triumph, aren't necessarily the primary mechanism for increasing patient access, the deeper question is, how else has the system changed? If the problem wasn't the FDA saying no, but the process being too burdensome, what have the regulators in the industry done to meet this desperate need?
The FDA itself has responded pretty aggressively to the administrative criticisms that fueled the RTT movement. Their biggest step has been streamlining the expanded access process itself. They simplified that often cited burdensome application form. They replaced the original long document with the much shorter form FDA 3926, and they modified the IRB review requirements to make it easier for community physicians.
But they went a crucial step further in 2019 by launching something called Project Facilitate. And this is a fascinating innovation in government bureaucracy. It essentially turns the FDA into a concierge service for pre-approval drug requests, initially focused on oncology.
It's a great way to put it. Project Facilitate created a dedicated department within the FDA. This department fields calls from physicians and patients, a central communication point. They then proactively help the physician complete the necessary application, Form 3926.
So they do the paperwork.
They help with the paperwork. And once that's done, they forward the application to the necessary institutional review board for review, and then submit the request to the drug company for a final determination, all within a specified expedited time period.
This essentially removes that administrative burden from the busy treating physician. Instead of spending hours wrestling with forms, the doctor can call the FDA, and the FDA team handles the logistics. This is a direct operational response to the very critique leveled by RTT advocates. It proves the FDA listened to the feedback about complexity.
And we've also seen crucial industry self-regulation and transparency improve, largely in response to the intense public pressure campaigns and social media scrutiny from cases like Andrea Sloan's.
Right, some major companies are now much more transparent about how they make these decisions.
Exactly. Pfizer, for example, now publicly discloses its overall expanded access approval rate on its corporate website. And this kind of transparency helps manage patient expectations, and it reduces that perception that the process is entirely opaque and arbitrary.
And other companies, like Janssen, are introducing external review to remove themselves from the emotional spotlight of the decision.
Yes, Janssen uses the COMPAC approach, the Compassionate Use Advisory Committee. This is an external review committee made up of bioethicists, physicians, and patient advocates who provide an independent recommendation on expanded access requests. This helps remove the public misconception that the company's default answer is always no and builds confidence in the fairness of the process.
But arguably the most potentially impactful change, one that operates entirely within the rigorous FDA framework, is focused on fixing the system earlier in the pipeline, addressing clinical trial exclusion criteria.
This is a monumental point. I mean, think about it. One of the primary reasons patients seek RTT or expanded access is that their specific medical profile, their severity, their prior treatments, their comorbidities disqualifies them from enrolling in a clinical trial in the first place.
They're too sick or too complex for the trial's narrow criteria.
Exactly. And organizations like the American Society of Clinical Oncology, ASCO, and Friends of Cancer Research have worked together to identify these common exclusion factors that severely limit patient participation. These are rules written into trial protocols that unnecessarily bar patients who could potentially benefit.
What are some of those factors?
They often include things like the presence of stable brain metastases, arbitrary age limits, being too young or too old, specific prior diagnoses, HIV status, or even mild to moderate organ dysfunction. These exclusion factors are often included out of regulatory caution or just for simplicity, but not always because the drug would pose a direct danger to that patient population. They just artificially narrow the patient pool.
So their goal wasn't just to list the problems, but to propose concrete protocol recommendations to broaden eligibility safely. They asked, what if we design trials to include more of these patients?
And the potential impact of adopting those recommendations is staggering. It should be the focus of major regulatory discussion. One study estimates that adopting these common sense protocol changes could immediately allow at least 6,317 additional patients to join cancer trials each year.
And that's a crucial distinction. This provides access within the existing rigorous safety and efficacy framework, complete with IRB oversight and data collection, not outside it through try.
Exactly.
Finally, the RTT movement itself hasn't stopped. It's evolved to address the cutting edge of medicine. The Goldwater Institute, seeing the rise of hyper-personalized treatments, is now pushing something called RTT 2.0.
Yes, this is aimed specifically at individualized treatments. This is a recognition that the FDA's current regulatory structure, which is optimized for batch-produced, mass-market drugs, is just ill-suited for the rapid, personalized nature of precision medicine.
We're now talking about treatments that are tailor-made for specific individuals based on their unique genetics, like a therapeutic cancer vaccine designed only for a single person's unique tumor cells.
Right, and the argument is logistical. If a treatment is created for just one person, how can it ever undergo a large-scale phase 3 trial with thousands of people? The speed and manufacturing variability inherent in creating a product for an N of 1 patient just doesn't fit the traditional regulatory model. RTT 2.0 seeks to create a pathway for these unique, personalized therapies.
And this new pathway has already passed in states like Arizona and Nevada. It's intended to work in tandem with the federal RTT law, creating a defined legal framework for a healthcare facility to manufacture and administer an individualized treatment under certain conditions.
And this is a huge but, the financial framework remains identical to the original RTT laws, which underscores the enduring access problem.
Let me guess. Manufacturers aren't required to provide the treatment, and insurance isn't required to pay for it.
You've got it. Manufacturers and providers are not required to provide the treatment. And crucially, insurance companies and taxpayer-funded programs like Medicaid or Medicare are not required to cover the immense custom costs of these treatments, though they may choose to. So while RTT 2.0 addresses a genuine regulatory gap created by precision medicine, it doesn't solve the fundamental issue of accessibility, the cost barrier, and the willingness of the provider to take on the liability and administrative burden without any certainty of payment.
The political solution created a legal path, but it didn't solve the financial or the supply chain realities.
Mhm.
We started this deep dive with that undeniable, agonizing tension at the heart of the right to try movement. The profound ethical appeal of a terminally ill patient seeking one last shot at life
Mhm.
versus the absolutely crucial societal safeguards that the FDA was created to enforce, often following historical tragedies that demonstrated the high cost of unchecked medical optimism.
And our analysis confirms that that tension is still very much alive. The Trickett-Wendler Act created a legal parallel pathway that allows patients to skip FDA review and obtain drugs that have only cleared that initial low safety bar of phase I testing. But despite this new law, despite the intense political momentum behind it, the critical cold reality remains.
That neither the federal RTT Act nor the FDA's streamlined expanded access program can compel a manufacturer to provide the drug.
Exactly. That voluntary decision by the pharmaceutical company, driven by concerns over supply, the immense non-recoverable cost, and the legal risk that a negative outcome could compromise their multi-billion-dollar approval chances, that makes the company the ultimate non-negotiable gatekeeper of access.
So the full impact of right to try really remains to be seen, especially as the FDA continues to aggressively simplify its own established, reviewed pathway with things like Project Facilitate, and as the industry improves its own transparency and review systems.
So here is a provocative thought for you to consider as you process all this information. If broadening clinical trial eligibility, specifically by safely reducing restrictive criteria like arbitrary age limits or certain disease histories, could immediately help thousands more patients access investigational drugs under existing safety efficacy standards every single year, as the study suggests, how might shifting the primary focus from creating new, non-FDA reviewed pathways like right to try to fundamentally improving trial inclusion change the entire process of drug development for all patients, not just those who are terminally ill?